Today's request is brought to us by patron Andre Mihai. Andre wanted me to take a look at a seminal science fiction novel titled Solaris, which was written by Polish author Stanisław Lem in 1961. About the author. Stanisław Lem was born in Poland in 1921, although the city he was born in is today a part of Ukraine. Like every European from his generation, Lem was deeply affected by World War II. When the Soviets occupied East Poland, his family was rich enough to be abused by the communist regime. And when the Nazis swept through, his family's Jewish heritage made them targets. Fortunately for the Lems, no one in their immediate family practiced the Jewish faith, so they avoided the ghettos and death camps by forging some papers. Following the war and East Poland's annexation, the Lems moved to Krakow, where Stanisław studied medicine. He didn't finish his exams, however, because by this point the Iron Curtain had fallen, and doing so would have forced him to become an army doctor. Instead, he got by working at a hospital, and in his free time, he wrote stories. Lem's chosen genre was science fiction, partly because of his scientific background, and possibly because communism supported science fiction thanks to that old utopian idealism. Nevertheless, state censorship meant that while Lem wrote his first novel in 1948, his first published novel came out in 1951. The novel's title is The Astronauts, and it's a youth fiction book that takes place in a communist utopian future. Lem would later mention that he added the bits about communism specifically to get the book published, and the main plot is about the Tunguska meteor impact, which turns out to have been a fallen spaceship from Venus. The spaceship contains an ominous message about invading Earth, so Earth sends a spaceship to Venus. There, they discover that the invasion never happened because the Venus civilization destroyed itself in a nuclear civil war. And I'm pretty sure that, aside from communism references, American Cold War science fiction has had a dozen variations on the same thing. It might also sound familiar if you're a Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan, since it got adapted, one might say mangled, into a film in East Germany in 1960, and then further mangled and dubbed into English as First Spaceship on Venus. The Astronauts was a big success for Lem, enough so that he quit his day job and started writing full-time. The censors would continue to make sure that he towed the party line throughout the 50s, but in the 60s and onwards, relaxing censorship and Lem's growing fame meant that he could start writing about topics he wanted to write about without making asides about how great communism is. Such is the case with Solaris, in which the only thing we know about Earth politics is that there are 4 major powers and they agreed not to use powerful X-rays on each other. In Poland, it's just one more book in Lem's long bibliography, but Solaris achieved an unusual level of fame here in the West thanks to a French and then English 1970 translation, not to mention the 1972 movie directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. Solaris also got a 2002 adaptation, directed by Steven Soderbergh. That one is less well remembered. Good soundtrack, though. Anyway, that's enough about adaptations. It's about time I discussed the story. The story of Solaris begins long before the story of the book's protagonist. This story is told in pieces throughout the novel, but for simplicity's sake, I'll be explaining it chronologically. Originally, the planet Solaris was just one out of thousands of exoplanets charted and then forgotten about during humanity's galactic expansion. It was only notable because it orbited a binary star system, and mathematical projections predicted that it would fall into one of its stars within 500,000 years. But then someone took a second look years later and noticed that it wasn't on its projected path. It was on a stable orbit, and it was apparently defying physics to do so. An expedition sent to the planet discovered that it was covered in a viscous organic ocean, and that the movement of this ocean was somehow correcting the planet's orbit. The first thought was that this was some sort of natural, if unusual, phenomenon, but it soon became obvious that the ocean was alive. It would produce some strange structures out of the muck, things that the original explorers would call extensors, symmetriads, asymmetriads, and mime worlds. The Mimoids in particular proved that the ocean was alive. They got their name because they had this uncanny ability to mimic any non-living thing on the planet. For instance, a Mimoid wouldn't mimic a live plant, but it would mimic a carving of one. With it confirmed now that the planet's ocean was alive, efforts began to try and understand what it was doing and make contact with it, if contact was possible. But these efforts proved fruitless. The strange creations of the Solaris ocean never seemed to repeat themselves. And while people ascribed certain emotions or thoughts to certain emissions and structures, they had no predictive power and were thus, scientifically, worthless. Researchers would use instruments and recording devices on the ocean, and the ocean would even change the function of certain devices when they were inserted, but to what end, no one knew. This led to a backlash from the scientific community, who decided, for ego's sake, that Solaris was a dying creature, and the structures were thus its mindless death throes. Then pseudoscience took over with 1,000 different hypotheses, and then a sort of religious fervor took over, as certain people grew obsessed with making contact with this alien intelligence. The fervor experienced its own backlash, and then this backlash took on a mystical tone, as people took the original dissenters out of context and refused to think for themselves. Thus, when the protagonist's story begins, the research facility on Solaris that hovers above the ocean using anti-gravity and once housed 100 researchers now contains only 3: Snow, Sartorius, and Jabarian. The protagonist, Kelvin, is an experimental psychologist who once wrote a thesis about how certain brainwave patterns connected to strong emotions seem to have analogies in emissions from Solaris. This got on the attention of Jabarian, and he took Kelvin under his wing until he left to study Solaris in person. Now it's Kelvin's turn to go, but there's something off about the hovering research station, and he crash lands because the automated systems are offline. Kelvin survives the landing thanks to the safety equipment, but the station is in disarray. Sartorius has locked himself in his room, and Snow is strangely suspicious of Kelvin when they first meet. Still, Snow calms down after a moment, and he explains that Jabarian is dead. He killed himself with a lethal injection. They're keeping his body in the freezer. Kelvin can hardly believe what he's hearing, especially since Snow is evasive on a lot of topics. But when he checks Jabarian's room, he finds a giant mess and a cleared-out spot in the closet, where the man must have died. Kelvin also finds a full voice recorder, and as he leaves the room, he sees a black woman in a grass skirt straight out of Africa, who enters Jabarian's room without a word. When Kelvin checks the cold storage unit, he sees her again, snuggled up against Jabarian's frozen body, but perfectly warm herself, and with no calluses on her feet. A day or two later, Kelvin gets his own mysterious visitor, Rhea. Rhea was his wife 10 years ago, back when they were both around 19 and probably too young to get married. One day, Kelvin packed his things and left, and in response, she injected herself with a deadly chemical that Kelvin had brought home for an experiment. It soon becomes clear that the Rhea on Solaris isn't the real deal, or even close to it. She's a copy, created from Kelvin's impressions and memories of the real woman, and as such, she doesn't remember anything about herself outside of her relationship with him. Kelvin panics, and since the station has nothing like a brig, he locks Rhea in an orbital rocket pod. The pod then starts shaking in a way that a steel robot couldn't match, so Kelvin panics again and launches the rocket. This gets him some sympathy from Snow, who explains that the other 3 scientists have been through something similar. It all began a few months ago, when the scientists used what was technically an illegal level of X-rays on the ocean. These projections, these visitors, they started showing up after that, and while you can kill them or otherwise get rid of them, they always reappear the next time you wake up. Solaris seems to be able to reach inside people's minds, extract the most painful, repressed parts of their psyche, and then give them form. The Snow's thing isn't a dead lover, but it's apparently based on some dark emotions he felt but never acted on a couple of decades ago. Beyond that, he refuses to say. For his part, Sartorius has spent most of his time locked away with the object of his repression, and Snow doesn't know who or what it is. So, sure enough, Rhea reappears the next morning just like she did the day before, and she has no memory of getting blasted into space. Along with the second-hand memories, this Rhea also experiences anxiety when she can't see or hear Kelvin, and so she destroys his bedroom door when he closes it on her. Kelvin runs some tests on her, and while she's made of cells and proteins like a normal person, there are apparently neutrinos where her atoms and molecules should be. Now, neutrinos are subatomic particles that have almost no mass and travel at almost the speed of light. So by all rights, they shouldn't be subbing in for atoms, let alone creating something with a definitive mass and volume. Still, this does explain Rhea's super strength, her ability to survive without food or sleep, and the fact that she apparently showed up out of nowhere. It also means that the Solaris Ocean is incredibly powerful because it's the only thing that could have created her. Rhea also turns out to have a mind of her own. She steals and listens to Jabarian's tape one night, and she realizes that she must be a Solarian construct. She tries to do Kelvin a favor and kill herself by drinking a vial of liquid oxygen, but her inhuman design prevents her from dying. Kelvin responds by saying he loves her, and in fact the reason he loves her is because she isn't the original Rhea. He still blames himself for Rhea's death, but he doesn't have to feel guilty in front of this new Rhea because she's a different person. Or at least, that's what he keeps telling himself. Kelvin eventually speaks with Snow and Sartorius, and the scientists come up with two plans. One, to create a neutrino disruptor to get rid of the visitors for good, and two, to take a brainwave sample from Kelvin and broadcast it using X-rays into Solaris. Kelvin doesn't like either option, since he's not sure if he wants Rhea to disappear or not, but he agrees to the X-ray experiment since it seems less likely to work. After the experiment begins, Kelvin starts experiencing terrifying dreams. He starts out as formless and shapeless in an unknown void, but then an outside intelligence creates his body a bit at a time. Kelvin responds by creating a face for the intelligence, a female face, but not Rhea's. Meanwhile, he grows distant with Rhea, and eventually she goes to Snow and Sartorius, since they were working on the neutrino disruptor behind Kelvin's back. This destroys her for good, since something has happened to the ocean in the meantime, and it no longer creates projections. Snow, for one, is finally able to calm down and think clearly now that his torments are over, and he recommends they send out a report with the good news about their progress on Solaris. Kelvin decides that he wants to leave, but he wants to go stand on a mimoid, stand on Solaris' surface, before he goes. He does so, and when he touches the living ocean, he decides to forgive it for all the pain it unknowingly caused him. He doesn't expect Rhea will ever return, but he hopes that maybe she will, and so he changes his mind and decides to stay on Solaris. The end. The analysis. The premise of Solaris is very interesting. What if humans encounter an alien intelligence so inhuman that communication with it is impossible? Well, maybe not completely impossible. To paraphrase Thomas Edison, human scientists didn't fail to contact Solaris 400 times, they successfully discovered 400 ways to not contact Solaris. But then, one day, they tried something new, and it produced a completely novel reaction. And this reaction showed some detailed understanding of humans, how we're constructed, how we talk, and even how we think. The neutrino constructs may be patterned after the strongest memories of the humans on board the station, but after that point, they can think independently. They can create and retain their own memories, and they can develop motivations at odds with their creators and at odds with Solaris. After that, the scientists beam brainwaves into the ocean, and this produces another unique response. Solaris interacts with Kelvin, and although the interactions scare him, they also give him and Solaris more insight into each other. Solaris recognizes that it did something painful to the humans, and so it stops doing it. The communication happening here is hardly what you would call comprehensible, and it certainly isn't easy, but there is some definitive progress being made. This novel is less about the inevitability of failure when it comes to extraterrestrial communication, and more about the incredible difficulty of exploring a new field of science. It describes the arc of the hope of empty promises and the cynicism that follows when those promises inevitably fail to deliver. Every major invention goes through an arc of overhype, backlash, and real results, and that's basically what this book describes. Then there's another reading I got from this book, which is basically a statement about the human condition. After all, while the novel Solaris may describe a wholly incomprehensible alien, that's not what it actually is. It can't be. The book was born from a human mind and is therefore based on what that mind previously experienced. Nothing we imagine is wholly new, and even if it were somehow, it would be completely incomprehensible and we would gain nothing from it, except maybe a reflection from our own minds. So here's my reading. This is about two individuals trying to communicate. That's it. Any two people. Because, after all, we are ultimately mutually incomprehensible. We will never know what another person truly thinks. We can only attempt to communicate through the imperfect medium of words and body language, and even then, that's only when we aren't lying, either intentionally or unintentionally. We can even lie to ourselves by thinking in words that don't match our actual thoughts. Solaris has the ability to read the brains and thoughts of the scientists on board the station, but it can't comprehend them. To it, these brains speak a different language, and it can only understand the broadest of strokes, the greatest of the traumas locked inside. So it tries to use those traumas to communicate, not knowing that its "hello, nice to meet you" actually translates to "your mother is a whore." The humans react naturally to this insult, but the ocean, not knowing that it has insulted them, keeps repeating the same phrase over and over, because that's the only thing it knows how to do. And that is something that can happen between two people, because sometimes we come from two completely different places, and we have no idea how or why the other person might act differently. One person can love spiders, be completely fascinated by them. This person might want to give a spider as a gift, to share their love, and make the world a little happier as a result. But the subject of their gift has arachnophobia, and so they scream, they drop the spider, and they step on it. They think they rid the world of a monster, and made it a little happier as a result. Both people in this example had the best of intentions, and both people insulted each other by acting on these intentions. And this is what happens in the book. There's one last thing I thought I should mention. Right at the end of the book, Kelvin comes up with one last theory about what the Solaris Ocean really is. He describes an imperfect god, an immortal being of nearly infinite power, which nevertheless makes mistakes and missteps. It creates time and eternity, so that it has the space to create worlds and peoples. But none of them turn out the way it wants, and so this eternity becomes an infinite monument to its despair. Solaris isn't an imperfect god, but it could be a juvenile god, and so its mindless flailing and communication failures are examples of it learning about the universe around it. That would fit my analysis too, because the humans who are the most consistently bad at communicating are the ones who have had the least experience with being human, which is to say, they are young. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a Japanese animated movie about leaving your home realm behind.